Bianca Nazaru had everything: money, power, beauty, but no real friends. At 24, she was one of the youngest successful businesswomen in the city, inheriting her father's empire and making it even bigger. But wealth came with its own curse. Everyone she met wanted something from her. People came into her life with smiles, only to reveal ulterior motives later. Friends, business partners, even romantic interests, everyone had an agenda. It had made her cold, cautious. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. One sunny afternoon, Bianca sat on the edge of her bed, her arms wrapped around her knees. The silence in the mansion was suffocating. Her younger brother, Ben, was out as usual, probably getting into trouble. She didn't even have his usual antics to distract her today. She sighed. She needed to do something, anything, to shake off the boredom. Shopping. That always worked. Without wasting another moment, she grabbed her car keys, slipped into her designer sunglasses, and headed for the mall. The moment she stepped into the upscale shopping complex, heads turned. It wasn't just because she was Bianca Nazaru, the billionaire heiress, it was because she was breathtaking. Her caramel skin glowed, her pointed nose and perfectly sculpted cheekbones making her look like she had walked straight out of a magazine. Even in something as simple as jeans and a silk blouse, she carried herself with the kind of elegance that made people stare. Just as she was about to enter one of her favorite designer stores, a voice called out from behind her. "Bianca Nazaru." She froze. The voice was familiar but distant, like an old memory knocking at the back of her mind. Slowly, she turned around. Her eyes landed on a woman with warm brown skin, a sharp jawline, and a confident stance. Bianca squinted, her brain working to place the face. Then it clicked. Wait, is this Blessing Bacco? Britain Academy's head girl. Set 2017. Blessing's face lit up. Yes, it's me. She laughed, stepping closer. Wow, Bianca, you look amazing. I almost didn't believe it was you. Bianca felt a genuine smile creep onto her lips. It's been so long. What are you doing here? I just moved back to the city, and I'm actually here with Joshua Dada. You remember him, right? Bianca's breath caught in her throat. Joshua Dada. Of course, she remembered him. Her high school crush. The one she had admired from a distance but never dared to confess her feelings to. Back in school, he had been one of the few who didn't seem fazed by the social divide between the wealthy kids and the scholarship students. He was effortlessly charming, smart, and had a way of making people feel at ease around him. Before Bianca could even respond, a tall figure stepped into view. Josh had changed. He was taller, broader, and even more handsome than she remembered. His sharp jawline, deep brown eyes, and confident posture made him look like someone straight out of a movie. Hey, Bianca, it's been almost a decade, Joshua said with a wide grin, stepping forward and pulling her into a friendly hug. The scent of his cologne lingered as he released her. Bianca forced herself to act normal, but her heart was racing. I know, right? It's crazy how time flies. They stood there, catching up on lost time. Blessing filled Bianca in on how she had gone abroad for university and just recently returned. Joshua talked about his career and how he was finally settling down in the city. Bianca listened, laughing at their jokes and sharing a bit about her own life, but a part of her was still reeling from the encounter. When they suggested hanging out soon, Bianca didn't hesitate to agree. It had been a long time since she felt excitement bubbling inside her like this. Maybe, just maybe, she had found friends she could trust. Days later, Bianca met up with Blessing and Joshua at an upscale restaurant in the heart of the city. The place exuded luxury. Gold chandeliers, velvet chairs, and waiters who moved with effortless grace. It was the kind of place Bianca was used to, but something about tonight felt different. Exciting. She was meeting people from her past, people who felt real. But while Bianca was still on her way, Blessing and Joshua were already seated in a secluded booth at the back of the restaurant, deep in conversation. Blessing stirred her wine glass slowly, watching the deep red liquid swirl. A sly smile crept across her lips. Josh, I think Bianca still has a crush on you. Josh leaned back against the cushioned seat, smirking. Well, I already have you. He reached for her hand, tracing circles on the back of it. Blessing tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with mischief. But what if we use that to our advantage? Josh raised an eyebrow. What are you getting at? Blessing leaned in closer. She's a billionaire, Josh. We could play this right and make a fortune. Josh's smirk widened. You mean, I make her fall for me, ask for a huge amount of money, and then we vanish? Blessing grinned. Exactly. Josh chuckled darkly. Damn. My baby is so smart. He pressed a kiss to her cheek. Just then, Bianca walked in. She looked stunning, even in something as simple as a fitted blazer and high-waisted jeans. Heads turned as she walked toward them, her confidence effortless. If only she knew the trap she was walking into. Josh was the first to react. He shot up from his seat, spreading his arms dramatically. Give way for the beauty goddess Billionaire Heiress, he announced loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Bianca laughed, blushing slightly. Oh, stop it. Blessing forced a warm smile as Bianca sat down. We were just talking about old times, she said smoothly. It's so good to finally reconnect. The night went on with laughter and conversation. Bianca talked about her business, her struggles with trust, and how hard it was to find genuine people. Every word she said only made her seem like an easier target to Josh and Blessing. As the evening wrapped up, Josh leaned in and smiled at Bianca. You know, I've missed hanging out with you. Bianca felt a flutter in her chest. Me too. Josh picked up his car keys. Let me drive you home. Bianca hesitated for only a second before nodding. Sure. The drive was quiet at first, with only soft music playing in the background. Bianca stole glances at Josh as he focused on the road, his strong hands gripping the steering wheel. Her high school crush, now sitting beside her, driving her home like a scene out of a dream. You know, Josh said, breaking the silence, you've really done well for yourself. Bianca smiled. Thanks. It hasn't been easy, though. Josh turned to her briefly, his eyes warm. I can imagine. Must be tough knowing who's real and who's just after your money. Bianca sighed. It is. Josh reached out and gently squeezed her hand. Well, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Her heart skipped a beat. Days turned into weeks, and Bianca found herself spending more and more time with Josh. Just the two of them. At first, Blessing would tag along, but soon, she started making excuses to let them be alone. Bianca didn't question it. She was too caught up in the thrill of reconnecting with Josh. They went on late-night drives, shared coffee in cozy cafes, and talked about everything, except for Bianca's money. That was what made her trust him even more. He never brought up business, never asked for anything. He was just there, making her laugh, making her feel wanted. Then, one evening, it happened. They were at a rooftop restaurant, the city lights twinkling below them. The night air was cool, and Bianca had never felt more at ease. Josh reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Bianca, he said, his voice softer than usual. I don't know how to say this, but I've always had feelings for you, even back in school. Bianca's heart pounded. Really? Josh nodded, his gaze intense. I didn't say anything then because, well, the whole rich kid, scholarship kid thing made things complicated. But I don't want to let this chance slip away again. Bianca swallowed hard. She had dreamed of hearing these words for years. And now, here they were right in front of her. She barely hesitated. Yes, I will be your girlfriend. Josh grinned, standing up and pulling her into a hug. Over his shoulder, she didn't notice the quick glance he exchanged with Blessing, who was sitting a few tables away, watching everything unfold. Bianca had just fallen into their trap. Blessing tilted her head, a mischievous glint in her eyes. I mean, what if you lead her on, make her fall for you, and then when she's all in, we ask for a huge amount of money. Then we disappear. Joshua chuckled darkly. Damn, Blessing, you're ruthless. Blessing shrugged. It's just an idea. Joshua thought for a moment before grinning. Well, she is a billionaire, and billionaires don't feel heartbreak the same way regular people do, right? Blessing smirked. Exactly. They shared a knowing look before walking off. Bianca had no idea she was about to walk straight into a trap. Josh had invited her to a movie date, and Bianca had been looking forward to it all week. She stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the sleeves of her sleek, casual jumpsuit. It hugged her in all the right places, elegant yet effortless. She wasn't trying too hard, but she wanted to look good for him. For them. For once, she allowed herself to believe that this was real, that she had finally found someone who cared about her beyond the wealth attached to her name. Maybe, just maybe, Josh was different. By the time she arrived at the cinema, Josh was already there, standing in line for popcorn. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "Hey, babe," she greeted, smiling as she approached. Josh grinned. "Hey, sweet, you look beautiful." Bianca felt the familiar warmth of his words settle in her chest. "Thanks. What are we watching?" Josh glanced at his phone as it buzzed. "Hold on, babe. I need to take this call." Bianca nodded. "Okay. I'll wait here." She watched as he walked off, his posture shifting slightly as he put the phone to his ear. It wasn't unusual for Josh to take calls during their dates, but something about the way he glanced over his shoulder made her stomach tighten. He wasn't just answering a call, he was hiding. Minutes passed, then more. Bianca's patience started to wear thin. She tapped her foot, glancing toward the hallway where he had disappeared. What was taking so long? A bad feeling began to creep in, cold and unwelcome. Unable to shake it off, she stepped away from the counter and followed the direction he had gone. She moved carefully, scanning the dimly lit corridor leading to the restrooms. And then she heard it, his voice, low and hushed. She stopped, pressing herself against the wall. "Yeah, she's completely hooked," Josh whispered. Bianca's brows furrowed. Who was he talking to? Then she heard a laugh. A woman's voice. Familiar. Blessing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took another step forward, straining to hear more. "Just a little longer," Josh murmured. "After a few months, I'll ask her for the money, and then we run." Bianca's blood turned to ice. For a second, she thought she had misheard. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe. Blessing's voice rang out, clear and sharp. "She won't suspect a thing. She's completely in love with you." Bianca felt like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. It had all been a lie. Every sweet word, every touch, every late-night conversation. All of it. She forced her feet to move, rounding the corner. The sight in front of her made her stomach churn. Josh was leaning against the wall, phone pressed to his ear. A smirk played on his lips. But it was Blessing's name on his screen, not some unknown business call. He hadn't noticed her yet. Bianca stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor. Josh turned at the sound, his face draining of color as his eyes locked onto hers. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Bianca clenched her fists. Every fiber in her being wanted to scream, to cry, to demand why. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "It's over," she said, her voice firm, unshaken. Josh blinked. "Bianca!" She turned on her heels before he could finish, walking away without a second glance. He called after her. "Wait, it's not what it looks like." Bianca didn't stop. Her chest ached, but she refused to let herself break in front of him. She had been played, used, but she wouldn't let him see her cry. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she took a deep breath. Never again. The next day, Bianca woke up with a heaviness in her chest. The memory of Josh's betrayal clung to her like a bitter aftertaste. She had spent the night replaying the conversation she overheard, questioning everything. Every moment, every word, every touch. How had she been so blind? How had she let herself fall so easily into their trap? She needed a distraction. Without thinking much, she grabbed her purse and decided to go shopping. Retail therapy had always been her escape, the one thing that gave her a temporary sense of control. If she couldn't fix her emotions, she could at least fill her closet with new things. But even as she browsed through racks of designer dresses and expensive heels, the emptiness gnawed at her. The salespeople fawned over her as they always did. Other shoppers stared, whispering as they recognized her. None of it mattered. After an hour, she stepped out of the mall, exhaling deeply. Maybe this wasn't what she needed after all. Then, just as she was about to head to her car, she noticed him. A beggar sat on the sidewalk, his back against the cold concrete wall. His clothes were tattered, his hair unkempt, but there was something about him that made her pause. He wasn't looking down like most beggars did. Instead, he sat with his legs stretched out, gazing up at the sky as if lost in thought. Something about him felt different. Bianca hesitated before taking a step closer. "Hey, do you need food?" The man turned his head toward her, blinking in surprise. Up close, she noticed something odd. His features were sharp, his skin roughened by the streets, but his eyes were kind, warm, intelligent, like they held stories she couldn't begin to understand. He gave a small, lopsided smile. "I won't say no to that." Bianca nodded. Without another word, she turned on her heels and walked back into the mall. She bought fresh bread, bottled water, and a warm meal from a nearby cafe before returning to him. "Here," she said, handing him the bag. He looked at the food, then back at her. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." He accepted it, but instead of digging in like she expected, he studied her with quiet curiosity. "You don't seem like the type to stop for people like me." Bianca stiffened slightly. "What type do I seem like?" He shrugged, opening the water bottle. "The kind that has everything." Bianca let out a dry laugh. "Trust me, I don't." He tilted his head, as if reading something deeper in her voice. Then he extended a hand. "I'm Gideon." She looked at his outstretched palm, rough with calluses. She hesitated for just a second before shaking it. "Bianca." Over the next few weeks, Bianca found herself thinking about Gideon more than she expected. She visited him often, bringing food and clothes, but it wasn't just about charity anymore. She found herself enjoying their conversations. Gideon was different from anyone she had ever met. He was smart, witty. He had a quiet confidence about him, even though life had clearly been unkind to him. He never asked her for anything. He didn't fawn over her wealth or treat her differently because of who she was. And that's what pulled her in. One evening, as they sat on a park bench, sharing a cup of coffee she had brought him, Bianca sighed. "You know, you never told me how you ended up here." Gideon leaned back, exhaling. "Does it matter?" She turned to him. "To me, it does." He was quiet for a moment before he finally spoke. "Life happened. I had money once, a business, family. Then one bad decision led to another. Things spiraled, and here I am." Bianca frowned. "But you don't talk like someone who's given up." He chuckled. "Maybe I haven't." Silence stretched between them. Then Gideon turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Why do you keep coming back?" Bianca hesitated. She didn't have an answer. Or maybe she did, but she wasn't ready to say it out loud. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I just like being around you." Gideon smiled, but there was something deeper in his gaze. Something unreadable. The visits continued. Bianca found herself laughing more around him, feeling lighter. The pain of Josh's betrayal didn't sting as much when she was with Gideon. It didn't make sense. Falling for someone who had nothing. But she couldn't deny the way her heart raced when he looked at her. One evening, as they sat by the riverbank, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Gideon shifted beside her. "Bianca." She turned to him, her breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. "I don't have much to offer you," he said slowly. "No fancy cars, no business connections, just me. But would you be my girlfriend?" Bianca's heart pounded. She had spent so long guarding herself, expecting people to want something from her. But Gideon had never asked for anything. She smiled softly. "Yes." Gideon exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand in his. It was rough, strong, but it felt right. For the first time in a long time, Bianca felt something real. What she didn't know was that Gideon was hiding a secret of his own. Gideon had a secret. He wasn't homeless. He wasn't struggling. In fact, he was a billionaire. But Bianca didn't know that. He had spent weeks living on the streets, dressed in rags, blending in with the forgotten and ignored. He had met Bianca under the guise of a beggar, allowing her to believe he had nothing. And the worst part? He hadn't meant to lie, not at first. But as time passed, he found himself tangled in his own deception. Every moment with her made it harder to come clean. Every time she smiled at him without expectation. Every time she brought him food without asking for anything in return. Every time she sat beside him in that park, treating him like he mattered. Not for his wealth, but for who he was. It made him hesitate. Because for the first time in his life, someone saw him and not his money. But guilt gnawed at him. He had to tell her. He just didn't know how. Gideon wasn't just a billionaire. He was the CEO of one of the most powerful real estate firms in the country. His company, Titan Holdings, had projects spanning across continents. His face had graced business magazines, and his name was synonymous with power. But after a fallout with his board members, he had walked away from it all. He had wanted to disappear, to remind himself of who he was without the luxury, without the suits and the high-rise offices. That was how he had ended up on that sidewalk, lost in thought, when Bianca had approached him that day. And now he was in too deep. One evening, they sat on the rooftop of an abandoned building, overlooking the city lights. Bianca had found the place by accident, and it had quickly become their sanctuary. It was quiet here, far from the noise of the world. Bianca leaned back, staring at the stars. "I used to come here when I needed to think," she said softly. "It made me feel small in a good way, like no matter what I was going through, the universe was bigger." Gideon turned his gaze to her. "And what do you think about now?" She smiled, her eyes reflecting the city's glow. "I think about you." His chest tightened. He should tell her now. He should say the words, let the truth out, risk everything. But he couldn't. Instead, he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She trusted him. And that made it worse. The longer Gideon kept the truth from her, the heavier it became. Every time she told him about her business, her struggles, her dreams, he wanted to offer solutions. He wanted to tell her he understood because he had been there. But he bit his tongue, afraid of what would happen when the truth came out. What if she left? What if she hated him for lying? What if she felt betrayed? He wasn't afraid of losing his fortune, but the thought of losing her, that terrified him. One night, as they sat in a small cafe, Bianca laughed at something he said, and he found himself staring at her, completely lost in the moment. She noticed. "What?" He hesitated before saying, "You make me want to be a better man." Her expression softened. "You already are." He wanted to believe that. But could a good man lie to someone who had given him nothing but kindness? The next morning, Gideon stood in front of a sleek black car, parked just outside his penthouse. He had driven here straight from the shelter, where he had spent the night like he always did. His assistant, Raymond, leaned against the car, arms crossed. "You need to tell her," Raymond said, his voice firm. Gideon exhaled. "I know." Raymond studied him. "Then why haven't you?" Gideon ran a hand through his hair. "Because for once, someone doesn't see me as a walking bank account. She sees me, and I don't want to lose that." Raymond sighed. "And what happens when she finds out on her own?" That was the question Gideon didn't have an answer to, because deep down he knew Raymond was right. Secrets had a way of unraveling themselves, and when they did, the damage was often beyond repair. Monday morning came with the weight of new opportunities. Bianca sat at the long, polished boardroom table, reviewing the final contract documents for what could be one of the biggest deals of her career. The construction company she was about to partner with had an impeccable reputation, and this contract was set to expand her real estate empire even further. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing between business and her growing relationship with Gideon. Despite everything, she felt lighter around him. He was her escape from the chaos of her world. At least that's what she had believed. The boardroom doors swung open. The atmosphere shifted as everyone turned their heads to acknowledge the arrival of the CEO of the construction company. Bianca's pen slipped from her fingers. Her heart stopped. She blinked, convinced her eyes were playing tricks on her. The man walking in wasn't a stranger. It was Gideon, but not the Gideon she knew. This Gideon wasn't in tattered clothes or worn-out sneakers. He wasn't carrying the familiar scent of the streets. Instead, he was in an expensive tailored suit, his hair neatly styled, exuding the authority of a man who was used to being in control. His presence commanded the room. Bianca felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her. No, this can't be happening. Gideon stopped mid-step as his eyes landed on her. His entire body stiffened. The easygoing smile he usually wore was gone, replaced by something else. Guilt. Her lips parted, but the words felt lodged in her throat. She forced herself to breathe. Gideon. The room went silent. Murmurs of confusion buzzed among the executives. The construction firm's representatives looked between the two of them, sensing the sudden tension. Bianca gripped the edge of the table, her pulse roaring in her ears. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "And why are you dressed like an elite?" Gideon hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Bianca, I can explain." Explain? There was nothing to explain. He had lied. He had deceived her, just like the others. Her mind raced through every moment they had spent together. The shared laughter, the deep conversations, the nights when she had held his hand, believing that, for once, she had found someone genuine, someone who saw her, not her fortune. But it had all been a lie. Gideon wasn't some struggling man trying to survive. He was powerful, rich, just like her. And yet, he had let her believe otherwise. He had let her pity him. Bianca's throat burned, but she forced herself to straighten her posture. Taking a slow, deep breath, she turned to her assistants and legal team. "This deal is off." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Gideon's eyes widened. "Bianca, wait." She stood abruptly, pushing her chair back with a screech. "You lied to me." Her voice was steady, but the pain in her chest was unbearable. "You let me believe you had nothing. And the whole time, you were sitting on an empire." His hands curled into fists. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like, Gideon?" She shot back. "Were you testing me? Did you want to see if I'd still care if you had nothing? Or was it some cruel joke to watch the billionaire heiress fall for the poor man?" Gideon's expression darkened. "I never meant to hurt you. But you did." Bianca's voice wavered slightly, but she refused to break. "You knew how much betrayal has cost me. And yet, you lied to my face every single day." Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. The executives watched the exchange unfold like an unexpected drama. Bianca knew she was making a scene, but she didn't care. This wasn't just about the deal. This was about her. With one last look at Gideon, the stranger in a suit, she turned on her heels and walked out. Gideon called after her. His voice was low, desperate. "Bianca, please." But she didn't stop. She walked out of the boardroom, out of the building, and into the cold reality of another heartbreak. Gideon stood frozen in place, his chest rising and falling with frustration, his hands clenched at his sides. He had expected Bianca to be shocked, but he hadn't been prepared for the raw betrayal in her eyes. He had lost her, and this time there was no fixing it. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Bianca buried herself in work, trying to push away the betrayal, the confusion, the aching disappointment. She was used to being deceived, used to people pretending to be someone they weren't just to get close to her. But Gideon, he had been different, or at least she had believed he was. Her phone rang for what felt like the 100th time that week. Gideon. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the decline button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Every missed call from him only reminded her of the weight in her chest. This wasn't like before. Josh and Blessing had plotted against her, schemed to rob her. But Gideon, his deception hadn't been out of greed. He hadn't taken advantage of her, hadn't asked her for anything. He had just hidden the truth. Maybe she had overreacted. Or maybe she had been too hurt to see the difference between a lie meant to harm and a lie meant to protect. Sighing, she finally did what she had avoided for days. She picked up her phone and dialed his number. The garden was quiet, secluded. It was the same place where Gideon had first asked her to be his girlfriend, where he had looked at her with nothing but warmth in his eyes. Now, the air between them was heavy, filled with things left unsaid. Gideon was already there when she arrived, standing near a bench, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. He turned when he heard her footsteps, relief washing over his face. Bianca! She stopped a few feet away from him, folding her arms. You've been calling. He nodded. I would have come to you, but I figured you wouldn't want that. She exhaled. I didn't. Silence stretched between them, but Gideon refused to look away from her. He had no excuses, no justifications left to offer. Only the truth. I should have told you, he admitted finally. From the start. Bianca studied him, searching for deception. But all she saw was sincerity. Regret. Why didn't you? She asked. Gideon ran a hand through his hair, looking almost embarrassed. I was scared you wouldn't love me for me. She swallowed, her heart twisting. So you lied. I never lied about how I felt, he said quickly. And I never planned for it to go this far. But then I met you, and you treated me like a person. Not a billionaire, not a business deal, just me. Bianca clenched her jaw. And did you ever plan on telling me? Yes. He stepped closer. But every time I tried, I got scared. Scared that the moment you knew, you'd stop looking at me the way you do now. Her lips parted slightly. And how do I look at you? Like I matter. Bianca inhaled sharply. He did matter. He had mattered since the first time she sat beside him on that sidewalk. Since the first time they laughed over coffee. But could she really forgive him? Gideon hesitated before speaking again. Bianca, I didn't want to deceive you. I just wanted to know what it was like to be loved for who I am, not what I have. She sighed, looking down at her hands. Do you really think that's the only reason I was with you? No, he said softly. But I didn't want to risk it. For a long time, she said nothing. The anger that had burned inside her for days had dulled, leaving only exhaustion behind. He had lied, but he hadn't betrayed her in the way others had. He had been scared of her judgment, of losing something real. And wasn't that what she feared, too? That people only wanted her for her wealth? Bianca looked up at him. No more lies. Gideon stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Never again. He reached for her hands, but he didn't pull her toward him. He just held them, as if grounding himself in her presence, as if waiting for her to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she smiled softly. Okay. Relief flashed across his face, and for the first time in days, she felt the tension in her chest loosen. Maybe they could start over. Maybe this time it could be different. Maybe this time it could be real. Weeks turned into months, and Bianca and Gideon's love grew stronger. Despite the rocky start, their bond had deepened in ways neither of them had expected. Gideon was no longer the man in tattered clothes, and Bianca was no longer just the billionaire heiress who had found love in the most unexpected place. They were two people who had chosen each other, not because of wealth, not because of status, but because of something real. With time, Bianca saw how much Gideon truly cared for her. He supported her business endeavors, encouraged her when she doubted herself, and made her laugh even on the hardest days. Unlike the others who had only seen her fortune, Gideon saw her, the woman beneath the wealth, the one who longed for love without conditions. And Gideon, he had never felt so at peace. He had spent years surrounded by power, by people who only valued him for what he could offer. But with Bianca, he didn't have to be a CEO. He didn't have to wear the mask of success. He could just be Gideon, the man who loved her with everything he had. One evening, as they walked along a private beachside resort Gideon had rented for the weekend, he knew there was only one thing left to do. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The waves rolled in gently, brushing against the shore as Bianca strolled barefoot in the sand. She closed her eyes, inhaling the salty breeze, feeling more content than she had in a long time. Gideon watched her, his heart pounding. He had planned this moment carefully, yet he still felt nervous. This was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with, and he wanted everything to be perfect. Taking a deep breath, he reached for her hand. Bianca! She turned to him, smiling. Gideon hesitated for only a second before dropping to one knee. Bianca's breath hitched. Her hands flew to her mouth as she watched him pull out a small velvet box. The world seemed to freeze around them. The sound of the waves faded into the background, and all she could see was the man kneeling before her. His eyes filled with nothing but love. Bianca Nazaru, Gideon said. His voice steady despite the emotions in his chest. From the moment I met you, you changed my life. You saw me when I thought I was invisible, and you loved me even when I didn't deserve it. Tears pricked Bianca's eyes. Gideon opened the box, revealing a breathtaking diamond ring that sparkled under the evening light. I don't care about the past. I don't care about where we started. All I care about is the future, our future. I want to spend my life loving you, making you happy, and proving to you every day that you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Bianca's hands trembled as she let out a soft gasp. Gideon looked up at her, eyes full of hope. Will you marry me? For a moment, Bianca couldn't speak. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she let out a small, shaky laugh. She had spent years building an empire, guarding her heart, and convincing herself that love was something fleeting, something unattainable. And yet, here he was, giving her everything she had ever wanted in the simplest, purest way. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Then louder, yes, 1,000,000 times yes. Gideon grinned as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood, pulling her into his arms. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, letting herself feel the warmth of his embrace. They stayed like that for a while, just holding each other as the sun dipped below the horizon, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Love had found them in the most unexpected way, and now they would build a future together, one where trust, honesty, and devotion would guide them through anything that came their way.